What did you find in a forest or on a road that made you run away without looking back? I was in the Shell WS Forest, a place I'd always heard mentioned in whispered stories, especially in the city where I lived. It's one of those places where people avoid going alone. The fog began to rise between the trees, and the sun filtered weakly through the fallen leaves, creating long shadows that made the forest seem like an endless labyrinth. But I didn't believe in those stories. My intention was to disconnect from everything for a while, to walk aimlessly and enjoy the tranquility that only the forest could offer. There was no noise other than the crunching of dry leaves under my boots and the distant singing of some birds. I didn't know that this walk would be the strangest of my life. As I went deeper into the forest, the paths became less defined, as if no one had been there in a long time. It wasn't my first walk through remote forests. But there was something different about the environment, something that didn't leave me completely at ease. A feeling that couldn't be clearly identified, but was present. Then, as I turned between a couple of trees, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A small hut, or what was left of it, was built in a rudimentary manner with old wood and fallen logs. I approached slowly, feeling my curiosity pulling me toward this makeshift shelter. But something inside told me I should be cautious. However, the desire to discover something different, something that wasn't seen every day, won. I peered through the broken wood and realized that inside there was nothing but a couple of old chairs covered in dust and cobwebs. There was nothing out of the ordinary, at least in appearance. But as I looked more closely, something in the air changed. The place that had seemed abandoned for a long time didn't have the kind of abandonment that one would expect. There was something odd, as if at some recent moment someone had been there, or perhaps hadn't been there yet. That's when I saw strange marks on the floor and walls, lines that didn't follow any logical pattern, as if something or someone had tried to write something in the air itself, but in a grotesque and disorganized way. I decided to take a step back, but I didn't do it with the same calmness with which I had arrived. A deep discomfort began to invade my stomach, and a feeling of being watched took hold of me. I turned to go back along the path. But something made me stop again at the edge of the forest. Between the shadows of the trees, a figure stood out against the little light that still remained. It was a human figure standing watching me. My heart was beating rapidly. But what disconcerted me most was its posture. It didn't seem natural, it was too rigid, and its movements were slow, almost jerky, as if it couldn't move freely. The figure wasn't saying anything, wasn't moving, just staring at me. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that maybe it was someone else who had gone to the forest to enjoy the day. But the way it was staring wasn't human. It wasn't a curious or friendly look, but something much deeper, as if it could see right into me. It was a blank, emotionless stare, as if the person standing there wasn't fully present. My breathing began to quicken, and the discomfort I felt turned into real fear. I tried to take a step back, but something inside me told me I should leave immediately. I didn't dare move too quickly. I didn't want to draw the figure's attention or seem paranoid. But as I walked further away, I couldn't help but sneak glances back. The figure still stood there, still, and it seemed to me that as I moved forward, the distance between us didn't increase, as if it were slowly moving closer. I actually felt the air pressure increase. And my legs began to tremble. A surge of fear swept over me, and without thinking, I quickened my pace. My heart was beating so hard that it seemed like my whole body was vibrating with every beat. I didn't want to look back. I knew if I did anything else, something even more terrifying could happen. I just ran. I ran through the trees, between the low branches that scratched my arms and face, without stopping. The sound of my own footsteps filled my ears, but it wasn't enough to drown out the fear I felt. I didn't know what was happening, but my instinct told me I had to run. That if I didn't, I wouldn't be the only one in the forest that night. When I reached the edge of the forest, my legs were exhausted, but I didn't stop. I ran until I reached the parking lot where I had left my car. Without looking back even once, the sound of the wind through the trees was chasing me, and a part of me knew that something was following me. I was out of the forest, but the fear remained. Finally taking hold of me as I started the car and began driving back to the city, I realized that my breathing was still rapid. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. And even though I was safe, something inside me knew that what I had experienced wasn't normal. The image of the figure at the edge of the forest remained etched in my mind, and even today, years later, I don't know what I actually saw. I never returned to Shallow Worlds. In fact, I avoided any voice, and for a long time, I don't know if what I experienced was real or if my mind played tricks on me. I only know that I never went near a place like that again without a compelling reason, and every time I hear stories about the forest, a shiver runs through my body because I know there are things in those places that shouldn't be explored. If you're enjoying it, subscribe. There was something strange about that day, but I didn't realize it until it was too late. I was used to going for runs in the morning at dawn when the streets were still empty and the air was fresh, clean, and it wasn't a professional runner or anything like that. But I enjoyed the tranquility of those early hours of the day. The sound of the wind through the leaves, the crunch of the branches under my feet, and, most importantly, the solitude. I lived in a small town on the outskirts, and since there weren't many people around, I could walk the paths near the forest without fear of running into anyone. But that day, something made me hesitate. I remember that, as usual, I started my usual route along the path that led into the nearby forest. It was a path well known to local runners, one that many of them used for its tranquility and natural beauty. Despite the stories circulating about that place, about those who claimed to have had strange encounters there, I had never felt anything out of the ordinary. But that day the atmosphere was different. The air was thicker, as if something was waiting to happen without giving it much thought. I continued forward. It was a cloudy morning, and the sunlight barely reached, filtering through the treetops. At first, everything seemed normal. My breathing was steady, my steps rhythmic. But as I moved forward, I realized that the path that had always seemed so familiar was beginning to feel narrower and darker somehow. The shadows seemed deeper, and the silence was almost absolute, except for the occasional crunch of a branch beneath my feet. I thought it was simply my mind playing tricks on me, like when you feel uncomfortable in a familiar place for reasons you can't explain. Then I saw it in the distance, a few feet away, in the middle of the path. Something caught my attention. There was a static, motionless figure. At first, I thought it was a joke or one of those people who dress strangely to attract attention, but as I got closer, my heart skipped a beat. It was a clown standing in the middle of the path with a red balloon in his hand. The figure seemed completely out of place. That context. His clothes were colorful but worn. His makeup was messy, and his eyes were empty and lifeless. He wasn't the kind of clown you'd expect to see in a circus or at a birthday party. This was a strange, almost macabre clown. I tried to convince myself that I was simply seeing things the wrong way, that maybe it was someone dressed up to play a joke. But there was something about the atmosphere that didn't fit. As I approached the figure, it wasn't moving, it didn't make a sound, it was as if it was waiting for something, or worse, waiting for someone. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. Still, I decided to keep going. After all, it was just a joke, or so I thought. When I was a few feet away, the figure began to move, but not in the way a human being does. It slowly turned its head toward me, and in that instant, the discomfort turned into pure terror. Its eyes, once empty, they now seemed to stare at me, as if watching my every move, waiting for me to do something, anything. The smile that adorned his face was twisted, larger than normal, and his stained, yellow teeth shone with a strange intensity in the dim light that came through the branches. It was as if the smile was made in a way that defied all logic, as if he weren't human, as if his face wasn't designed to smile that way. I couldn't move, I couldn't take my eyes off that thing. In my mind, everything blurred. My body was frozen in place, and my heart pounded with such brutal force that it made me feel the sound echoing in my head. It was then that the clown slowly raised his hand and extended the balloon toward me. The balloon was red, too red, as if it had been inflated with something other than air. The scene was so surreal that I felt a sweat break out. Cold running down my spine at that moment. Something inside me reacted. I don't know if it was instinct or the overwhelming fear that invaded me. But somehow my legs started to move, taking steps backward. Without thinking, I began to back away. Without taking my eyes off the clown, I didn't know why I wasn't running. Maybe it was the fear that by doing so, the situation would become even more dangerous. Each step I took back seemed to make the distance between us stop increasing, as if he were moving as slowly as I was, but somehow he was closer than I thought. It was a play of perspectives that left me completely disoriented. My hands were shaking and my breathing became more and more difficult. How had I gotten to that point? What was a clown doing in the middle of a lonely path in the woods? The fear grew so fast that it began to cloud my judgment. I decided I could no longer stay there, that something wasn't right. It was as if the clown was waiting for me to make a false move, something that would give him the excuse to get closer. And at that moment, my body he reacted completely without looking back. I started running. I didn't know if he was moving or not, but I couldn't stay there for a second longer. I ran without stopping, feeling the air hitting my face, the sound of my footsteps crunching the leaves beneath my feet. I didn't dare look back even once. The feeling of being followed, of being watched, consumed me, but I couldn't stop. Every time I tried to calm down and think clearly, a greater sense of danger washed over me. I only ran. When I finally reached the end of the path, almost at the edge of the forest, I stopped to catch my breath. But my legs were still shaking, fear kept churning in my stomach, and the sound of my breathing was all I could hear. I looked around, hoping to see the clown, but there was no sign of him. I don't know if it was my imagination or if I was actually in danger, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away until I reached my car. My hands shaking, I started the engine and quickly drove away from the forest. I never ran again. I never went near that place on those trails again. In fact, every time I pass near the forest, I feel a chill run down my spine. I don't know what I saw that day, but something tells me it wasn't just a clown. Something wasn't right. And although I don't know what it was, I know I don't want to know it again. Next story. I've been a Forest Service officer for over 10 years, and although most of the time working in the forest is peaceful, I can't deny that I've experienced situations that have given me goosebumps. However, what happened that day in Shadow WS was something I'll never forget. The kind of experience that changes the way you see things forever. It was just a normal day at work. I was doing my usual rounds in one of the most remote areas of the forest, where the trails aren't frequented by many. That most people don't dare venture into that area because there are rumors of strange disappearances and unexplained events, but I love trees, animals, and solitude. I never gave them much importance. I always believed it was all just old urban legends, stories told around the campfire to scare away tourists that day. However, I realized how wrong I was. Around 4 p.m., when I began to venture into a lesser-known part of the forest, I was looking for an old hiking trail that had been abandoned years ago due to lack of maintenance, but I still had to make sure the signs were in place and that there were no imminent dangers. The sun was beginning to set, and the light was dim among the trees. It was a perfect environment for work. As I ventured deeper into the forest, something caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just an optical illusion or some trick of my mind due to tiredness. But when I got a little closer, I saw that it wasn't a mirage. In front of me, about 50 meters away, there was a ladder, a simple wooden ladder placed vertically against a tree. It was a disconcerting sight. Who could have left a ladder here in the middle of nowhere? In such a remote place, there was no path nearby, no buildings visible, just a ladder leaning against a tree as if waiting for someone to use it. I approached cautiously and could see that the wood of the ladder was old. It was worn and partially covered in moss and leaves. It didn't seem to have been placed there recently, which made the situation even stranger. I looked around to see if I could find any clues as to where it had come from or who had placed it there, but I saw nothing else. No camp nearby, no sign of recent human activity. Out of concern, I started walking in circles around the stairs, looking for some kind of explanation. Was it a joke from some hiker? Or maybe an object lost by someone who I had decided not to burden myself with it anymore? None of these answers convinced me, and I began to feel that the atmosphere around me was changing. It wasn't that the place was particularly sinister, but there was a feeling in the air, a pressure as if space itself were denser than normal. I decided I'd spent too much time examining a simple staircase and began walking back toward my vehicle, trying to shake off that uncomfortable feeling. But before I could turn around, something made me stop. It was a subtle but clear sound, something like a creaking, coming from the direction of the stairs. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. However, what surprised me was that as I looked toward the stairs, the wood began to move, not in a natural way, as if a strong wind had hit it, but more as if someone was pushing at the base of the stairs. My breathing quickened. I couldn't believe what I was doing. Watching the air became heavier and the creaking of the wood became clearer, something more intentional. Then in a blink of an eye, the staircase tilted forward, almost as if it were being used, as if someone were climbing it, but there was no one there. The fear I felt was instantaneous, a primal fear that I couldn't control. My instinct told me I should leave, that something wasn't right, but my curiosity forced me to stay. For just one more second, it was the worst mistake I could have made. Suddenly, as if something had activated an invisible mechanism, a shadow appeared behind the staircase. It wasn't a normal shadow, it wasn't projected like a person or an animal would be, it was more like a dark, dense stain that seemed to swallow the light. Around it, the figure, if you can even call it that, was blurry and indefinite. It seemed to float, moving without a purpose. Of course, but the worst part was that it was close, too close. The air became cold and a shiver ran down my spine. My body reacted before my mind. Without thinking, I turned around and started running. I didn't look back even once. I just ran, stumbling over tree roots and the uneven forest floor. My legs moved almost automatically as my mind struggled to understand what had just happened. What was that shadow? What was that strange sensation? I couldn't explain. I was in shock, but terror drove me to keep running, to get as far away from that scene as possible. When I reached my vehicle, I jumped in and quickly started the engine. The feeling of being chased tormented me. I looked in the rearview mirrors, hoping to see something, some sign that I wasn't alone, but I saw nothing. The road was now my only refuge, and even though the vehicle was moving, I didn't feel safe. The shadow on the ladder continued to follow me. My mind never returned to that place. I never returned to Shella Woods. I left it behind, along with the strange memory of that staircase and the shadow that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Over time, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination caused by fatigue or stress, but deep down, I knew that what I saw, what I felt, was not something that could be explained so easily. Every time I pass near that forest, a strange feeling overwhelms me, as if something or someone were still waiting for me there among the trees. And although the legends about that place always seemed like superstitions to me, today I know that some stories are not just tales. Some stories are warnings. Next story, I'm not someone who believes in superstitions or local legends, but that time, something happened that made me question everything. This is the story of what happened in the so-called cursed forest and how, after what happened, nothing was the same. It was a group of friends, like anyone who decides to escape the routine of the city for a weekend. We had planned to camp in a secluded spot in a forest that, according to many, had a bad reputation. The locals always talked about the cursed forest as a place to be avoided. However, being young and adventurous, we decided it was the perfect place to spend a few days surrounded by nature. The fact that no one dared to camp there made us want to go even more, as if we were looking for a challenge. We all knew about the disappearances that had occurred in the past, but the stories were so vague and scattered that we didn't take the warning seriously. We arrived in the afternoon after a few hours of driving and began to set up our tents near a small stream at the edge of the forest. We were in an area known to some hikers, but according to the people in the nearby town, no one had really gone far since the interior of the forest was considered dangerous. However, we didn't it mattered a lot. We were excited to explore. We were the first to delve into what the town avoided on the first day. Without incident, we passed the time joking, short walks, and playing games, with the feeling of freedom that only being away from the city can bring. However, the night brought a heavier atmosphere. As we sat around the campfire, the silence of the forest seemed deep, almost oppressive. As the hours passed, we began to feel uneasy, as if something was watching us from the shadows, something we couldn't see, but was there waiting. It was a feeling that only appeared at nightfall, as if the forest itself were alive and breathing. On the second day, one of us named Mark decided to go deeper into the forest. He was the most adventurous of the group, always looking for something beyond the obvious. He told us he wanted to explore a deeper area, an area we had heard rumors about at first. We told him not to, that the forest was not a place to venture without a guide, but Mark didn't listen. He was determined. So with a defiant smile, he walked into the trees and told us he would be back in a few hours. Hours passed and Mark didn't return. At first, we thought he was just exploring more than he had planned. But as time passed, we began to worry. 3 hours after he left, we were already searching the edge of the forest, calling out to him, but there was no response. The feeling of unease that had invaded us the night before began to intensify. Something wasn't right. No one wanted to say it, but we all thought it was true. Something had happened. Something bad. We couldn't stop thinking about the stories we had heard in town about people who simply disappeared without a trace, as if the forest had swallowed them up. We decided to search further. But the shadows of the forest seemed denser, darker than we remembered. Every step we took felt like we were entering a strange place that didn't belong to the real world. It was as if the forest was changing as we moved, as if something were guiding us toward a destiny we couldn't escape. We called out to the sea by name, but the sunset was only the empty echo of the forest. The hours passed and despair took hold of us. Darkness was beginning to fall again, and the cold air was starting to chill our bones. When we had already traveled further than we thought possible, we reached a deeper area of the forest, a place where the trees grew more densely, as if forming a natural roof that blocked out any light. And it was there, among the shadows, that we found something that none of us expected. Mark was standing there with his back to us. It seemed as if he had been waiting for us. His figure was completely rigid, as if he wasn't moving. His clothes were dirty and his hair was tangled, But the strangest thing of all was his face. There was no expression on him. He didn't seem to have any consciousness. It was as if he were in a deep trance, or as if his body were there but his mind was somewhere else. We approached slowly, but as we did, a feeling of unease took hold of us. It was as if an invisible force was pushing us back. The air became thick, as if the forest itself was forcing us to retreat. We stopped a few meters from Mark, but he wasn't looking at us. He wasn't moving. He just stood there motionless, like a figure lost in time. It was then that one of us, Alex, decided to get closer. He had barely taken a step when we heard a strange noise, a creaking sound, as if something was moving among the trees. We all turned to look at each other, and in that moment, the air was filled with an indescribable tension. A deep, guttural sound filled the space, like a distant whisper that seemed to come from all directions. It was then when, without warning, he abruptly turned toward us. His once empty face now showed an expression none of us could describe. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was something worse, something that didn't belong to a human being. We stood paralyzed, watching his body twist in an unnatural manner. It was as if his being was being taken over by something we couldn't see, but we knew was there, watching us at that moment. Marx's figure vanished into a dense shadow, and all went silent. At first, we thought he was joking, but when we looked again, he was gone. Fear seized us, and without another thought, we ran back to camp. But when we arrived, nightfall immediately enveloped us. It was deeper than we remembered. No one said anything on the way back. We were terrified. We knew something wasn't right, but none of us dared to speak. The feeling of being watched didn't disappear. Something was following us that we didn't know what it was. Weeks passed before we dared to speak about what had happened, but none of us could offer an explanation. Mars' disappearance was officially recorded as lost, but there was never any evidence of his whereabouts or any sign that he had left on his own. And the worst part is that despite all our efforts to search for him, we never found anything. Since that night, the forest stopped being just a place to explore. It became something more, something that watched us from the shadows, waiting vigilantly, and even though years passed, the shadows of the cursed forest never stopped haunting us, and sometimes in my dreams, I hear the echo of the branches creaking, as if something were waiting, watching, and remembering.